Okay, everyone, welcome to our career exploration workshop covering social work and law enforcement. We have a really interesting, speaker here today, Marica Kelly. She's a program coordinator for the Victims Advocate Network at the University of Texas at Austin Police Department, which means that she recruits, trains, and supervises UT employee, volunteer advocates, and social work staff and graduate students who support any person, student, staff, visitor at UT who has a police report, who receives a police response following a crime or distressing incident. So she works in a really unique capacity within the law enforcement system, supporting the victims of crimes. And um, I think this offers a really unique career path for a social worker to go into, but I will let her speak for herself. I'm just kind of giving the opening, but it's really exciting. I'm super excited to hear what you have to say, Marica. So go ahead. I'll stop sharing. You take it away.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you for having me. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can start the learning. So, quick disclaimer, the content and opinions shared in this presentation belong to and represent Marica, the social worker, and do not belong to or represent UT Police Department or the University of Texas at Austin. Just gonna get that right out there. Because in this presentation, I'm going to be keeping it real. I'm going to be super frank and honest about all of the challenges and needs in this interesting and difficult job. And so I just want to be clear about a couple things just right out of the gate. And honestly, an hour feels like barely enough time to cover this topic because there is a whole lot that I have to say about this work. And I'm not going to mince words here. Policing is a profession in absolute crisis right now. It has been a system that has been broken in a variety of ways for quite some time. But, this year especially, I think was kind of a watershed moment for the profession. And that's just something that, I think I would lose all credibility in moving forward in this presentation if I didn't just acknowledge that truth. I just know I won't be sharing videos or images of police brutality in this presentation. That is not to disregard it or to gloss over it or protect that harmful truth. It is just simply because we don't have the time. There's so much to talk about. And because all of us are, I'm quite sure, aware we've all seen these things. And so I just don't want to cause more harm and trauma for attendees today. But that's not to say that I'm not well aware of it and that it's not an absolute concern for me in being in the system. We also have multiple systems in crisis, right? So in addition to the policing profession, there are a lot of things at play here. We have a housing crisis. We have a white supremacy, racism, homegrown violent extremism crisis, and a gun violence crisis, and a mental health crisis, and we're climate crisis, and we're all aware that all of these different things are kind of happening at once, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color's lives matter. I could spend the whole hour just on that, and I think that if you work in the policing space, especially as a social worker or someone that's a helping professional, if you cannot say that that BIPOC lives matter and that matter is the minimum, if you can't say that clearly and without any hesitation or discomfort, then you probably shouldn't be doing this work. But if you can say that, then we need you here. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Basically, my experiences in this system have broadened my understanding of its problems and have deepened my convictions of the need for those in the helping professions to occupy space here and assist with transforming it from internally as well as externally. I really think that system change requires folks on the inside and the outside of the systems. So I hope that what I share today will help some of you attending believe that that's possible and needed. So I actually learned to do a slide like this from the brilliant Shane Wally. I hope some of y'all are familiar with Shane here at the School of Social Work. Um, if you're not, then I hope you have the chance to be, because Shane is amazing. And essentially, I got this idea from Shane to kind of just lean into identifying the lenses and identities through which I navigate life, and acknowledging which of those identities carries privilege for me, which is certainly my race and the fact that I am white, that I have a master's degree, that I'm middle class, that I am cisgender, that I speak English as my first language, and I'm a citizen. And then acknowledging that there are aspects of my identity in which I don't hold privilege. For me, that's being female and facing harassment and discrimination and gender-based violence, being queer identifying, and the pieces that are in white around my identity just acknowledge that these are pieces that vary in privilege or not. My husband and children are people of color, and I have various health and mental health diagnoses, which vary from, being debilitating to being something I barely notice. It just kind of depends on the day. And so those are the pieces that I carry with me. And I just feel like it's important when giving talks to acknowledge the way I navigate these things. And it's important that we're mindful and intentional of the privilege, especially when doing this work, because in this system, I try to use my privilege, especially my white privilege, as almost like a Trojan horse way to provide, insights and have really important conversations with my colleagues and the people that I'm working with, because that privilege carries with it an ability for people to not have as much of their guard up when they're working with me. And so I kind of sneak all my stuff in as best I can to make this space and system better for people who maybe don't carry those same pieces of privilege. So a bit about my background, and this presentation won't be about me. I'm going to move right into policing and social work and policing, but I want to just also share how it is that I found my way here and what that journey looked like for me. It looks different for everyone, but I've spent several years working in residential treatment as well as emergency homeless shelters for youth. And then I found myself, this picture is back from 2015 in my undergraduate field placement, which was with the Healthy Homes program at Harker Heights Police Department. If y'all don't know, Harker Heights is near Fort Hood. So we worked with a lot of military families. We worked a lot of domestic violence cases. And this was really one of the first programs in Texas, to my understanding, that where the chief had this vision of utilizing social workers to assist with some of the frequent flyers that the police department was frequently responding to, whether it was homes with a mental health concern, or like frequent juvenile runaways, domestic disputes that kept happening. I mean, we responded, in our own vehicle to homes that officers would give us a referral for, whether it was like a hoarding home, a mental health concern, child abuse concerns, domestic violence, you name it. I mean, we saw a lot of things. And it was in that placement that I first really realized that police officers were receiving kind of like warrior-based training that was like really militarized, and then being handed the job of a social worker that really required them to be social workers, but with this like really militant training. And so I saw this disconnect, and I saw and heard directly from officers that they felt really ill-equipped to actually respond to a lot of these things. And I saw that a lot of what was needed was prevention instead of like continuing police response, like after a fire would happen. Like we needed to prevent the fire in the first place instead of them just constantly going out and putting it out and going out again. So that was kind of like my first experience in that work. And that led to several years of working at a children's advocacy center. This image on the right of the slide kind of paints the picture of how a CAC works if you're not already familiar. Essentially, when a child makes an outcry of abuse or they are a witness or experiences violent crime, then they are brought to this center where they receive what's called a forensic interview, so that they only have to tell their story one time to a person who is specially trained to not be leading, and to be able to speak to children. And it's recorded so that the team, which is CPS or also police, can then do their investigation, and the child doesn't have to be questioned multiple times and speak to people about their story again and again. And at that center, they can also receive medical treatment, therapy, and then the role of the family advocate, which was my role, is to support their hopefully non-offending caregivers through navigating the whole process. And that may be CPS or law enforcement or both. And so I worked with this like multidisciplinary team. And it was there that, again, I saw all of the reasons for why people may need to work with police in these systems, and why they also really, really need social workers in those spaces to kind of foster that journey for them. It was at this work that I really developed a love for building programs. So I started grad school at Steve Hicks in January of 2018 as an app student with a focus on program development. And then it just turned out that there was this internship opportunity with VAN, and I was hired actually during that internship as their interim program coordinator. And then when I graduated, they hired me as their official full-time program coordinator. So I really helped with the month that program launched, from just building it from the bottom up, equipping it with infrastructure, and then a team. And so I'll tell you all a bit more about the VAN program. But first, I want to tell you guys really quickly about the opportunity in grad school that was just the most impactful for me. And it really was like the spark that ignited like a flamethrower of my passion in this work. And that was Professor Doug Smith, senior policy analyst with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. He's actually giving a talk right now. Professor Smith had our policy class learn about the sequential intercept model. And I have our website that our class actually built. So maybe I can get these slides out to folks and they can check it out there. But it essentially shows several different places along the scope of involvement in the legal system, from pre-arrest through incarceration, where we've identified points throughout that system where we can be most impactful in preventing like recidivism and just involvement in it at all, by meeting certain needs and building certain reforms. And so it was also in doing this work that I was able to kind of form this vision of a fully equipped fourth branch of emergency response. So we think about how we have police, fire, and EMS, but what I would really love to see is a fourth branch of that is just as equipped as the other three, that is solely meant to be like first response for mental health concerns, and also the intersection of mental health and substance use that we so often see. And so that was one of the really critical like changes at Intercept 1, which is what happens when people see someone acting strangely and then they dial those three numbers, right? They call 911, and who shows up? Like, who answers that phone? It's police. And when police are dispatched to mental health, and they're not trained as social workers or equipped to give that response, then we can see some, at worst, just absolutely horrendous, harmful outcomes like murders, or at best, if people aren't connected to community resources, then they're essentially placed in jail, or find their way into the prison system. And we're just learning, we've been knowing that that's not treatment for mental illness and substance use. And so, building out new ways of responding to those concerns initially and preventing them from ever even having legal system involvement for those needs is something that I'm super passionate about. So A little bit more about VAN and this program. VAN is a collaborative program between the UT's Employee Assistance Program and UT Police Department. So social workers and police built this together. And VAN is a network of UT employees, staff, and faculty who volunteer, and they complete about 30 hours of initial training, and then they do 2 hours per month of continuing training to hold on-call availability to provide immediate support to any student, staff, or visitor to campus who receives a police response following a crime or distressing event. And our advocates provide psychological first aid, crisis intervention, needs assessment, and then immediate referrals to campus or community resources. So our VAN staff and also our grad student interns from Steve Hicks provide follow-up and case management to make sure that folks' needs are met. And we have 25 advocates, and we've supported over 200 of our community members in our first 2 years. So that's a bit about VAN and what fills my day to day. And just a glimpse at like the types of responses that we've provided. These numbers are the actual quantity of these offense types or event types that we've responded to. That's not the number of people served, because it may be multiple people impacted on a call, but we've responded, as you can see, to assaults and sexual assaults, stalking and harassment, intimate partner violence, indecent exposure, medical emergencies, robberies, thefts, burglaries. And then I've kind of painted the picture of what that other category can entail and what types of other just distressing events our officers might be called to respond to, and that we will then also come out and give support to our community members for. So it's a really holistic approach of making sure everyone has their needs met when they receive a response after something like this. So a bit more about the services provided in the space in social work and policing. I already kind of touched on what that immediate response by our advocates entails. And then to elaborate further on the services and case management by our staff, we sometimes provide police interview accompaniment. That certainly happened a lot more before COVID because we're now working remotely, but we also provide death notifications, lethality risk assessment for people experiencing intimate partner violence. And that can be a really, really powerful intervention that kind of moves them from the pre-contemplation stage to like being ready to act and get out of that relationship and start assessing what their barriers are and how we can assist them in removing those barriers. We provide safety planning and just like emotional support as victims navigate their options in their case. And what we really aim to do is just to provide them with their menu of options and just kind of hold the flashlight on the trails in front of them so that they are fully informed of which paths they can take without ever placing pressure on what their decision needs to be. We also provide documentation for folks for like early release from their lease. If they're experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, we assist with applying for and kind of navigating crime victims compensation for folks who have financial expenses as a result of a crime they've experienced, which helps kind of with making them whole, at least in the financial sense, from that crime. And we also collaborate with our officers and our campus partners on threat assessments and service delivery just to coordinate care for folks and make sure everyone's needs are met. So a bit more about why we do this. We're not here to just serve the police. We are here to support our community members. And we have, of course, a client feedback survey and some answers to their questions like, what did you find most helpful? I feel like it's awkward if I don't read these and it's awkward if I do, so I'm just gonna read them. But some clients with us shared Danica, who is our wonderful and amazing full-time case manager, also an LMSW like myself, was genuinely invested in helping me and I felt really heard. She also provided very helpful information about available resources. Another person said, for my personal situation, I believe pretty much everything the advocates did and said was perfect. Their approach was eager, but not pushy or aggressive. I appreciated that. We've also asked, like, what else do you want to share with us? And one person said, please always do whatever is necessary to maintain the availability of these services for our campus community. I didn't know I would need them, but was beyond grateful that they were available to me. I can say with 100% certainty that I would not be where I am now if I wasn't able to get this help at no cost to me. And that just speaks volumes about how impactful it can be for us to provide someone with a letter that can get them out of their lease without being on the hook for thousands of dollars and knocking down that barrier to getting out of an unsafe situation, right? We never know just like how impactful one of our interventions can be on the trajectory of a person's whole life. So that one's really powerful for me. And another person who just said, I think it helped to have someone talking to me while I was waiting to see if the police officers needed any other information. That kept me from just sitting and rehashing the event over and over. And this just speaks to why this multidisciplinary collaboration is so needed, right? Because officers have like this laundry list of things that they have to attend to on a scene. They need to, you know, if there's like a fatality, then they need to cover up the body and the scene so as to reduce further traumatic exposure for community members. They're calling a medical examiner, they're securing the area, they're arranging transportation, they're taking evidence and multiple witness statements. And when you have multiple people impacted on a scene, then people are literally just sitting on a curb, kind of waiting for their turn. And so for us to be the humans that come onto this scene and we're immediately giving them crisis intervention and psychological first aid, and assessing what they're needing, giving them a bottle of water and a blanket, and just kind of tending to the variety of their needs. It really is this kind of holistic level of care that, you know, for a really long time was overlooked and didn't get addressed on these scenes before social workers started occupying space here. Okay, here's my TED Talk. And I know I'm talking a lot, and I know that some of my slides are really text heavy. So don't start reading this quite yet, because I'm going to tell it to y'all. But this is a slide that I pulled literally out of my orientation training for our advocates. Because I am absolutely not trying to have a team of advocates who come onto a scene without having a trauma-informed understanding of the history of police response for our community members. So this is what I tell my team before anyone ever starts doing van work. I tell them, in this work, it is critical that we understand the dark and harmful history of policing in the US, guarding colonists from natives who are trying to protect their lands and people, enforcing slavery and acting as slave catchers, conducting crowd control at lynchings post-Reconstruction, direct ties to the KKK, enforcing laws tied to white supremacy, spraying civil rights protesters with hoses, traumatizing them with dogs, beating them bloody at the bridge in Selma, and disproportionate levels of arrests, uses of force, fatal shootings against people of color that persist to this day. And I haven't even started on the history of between police and LGBTQ plus folks or Indigenous and AAPI populations and other marginalized and oppressed communities. If this history is unfamiliar to you, I recommend first understanding that there is privilege in not needing to know this history until now. And next, I recommend seeking out that knowledge to be better informed. Please understand that there are members of our community who are unlikely to ever call the police for the reasons stated above, but they might still receive a police response at some point, and that'll be out of their control. So we must understand that for some folks, receiving a police response is traumatic and distressing in itself, even if the police have the best intentions and are there to help. So while there are absolutely many officers from diverse backgrounds and identities doing this work who act ethically, honorably, and uphold their oath to serve and protect, we must understand that for many community members, their uniform represents that traumatic history, and their gun represents an immediate safety threat. And we should never come onto a scene assuming that the folks impacted are relieved that the heroes in uniform arrived to protect them. That may not be their truth. We need to be able to hear and validate their discomfort with officers if that's how they feel. They may need us to be a buffer for them in that moment and a reassurance that we're all here to help them and they'll be safe with us. So I give this slide to every single one of our advocates who joins our team to do this work, because it is just of utmost importance that we approach our responses with that trauma-informed understanding. Okay. And kind of on that note, I also want to just like share a little bit about this thing that I've grappled with since I started doing social work in the policing space since 2015. And it's something that's come up for me again and again, because I've seen these like two different truths happening over and over again of like, I've seen a life-saving work, I've seen absolutely needed work, heroic, brave, compassionate work, and I've seen some really harmful, horrendous things too. And honestly, I think kind of the perfect microcosm that really captures that both of these exist was on January 6th, right? So like we all kind of saw as a nation, Officer Goodman act heroically and bravely. We all knew that our elected officials were in grave danger, and I think many of us were scared that some of them could seriously be harmed, and we wanted the people who we've tasked with protecting them to fill that role, right? And Officer Goodman did that with bravery and heroism. On that same day, in that same event, same building, we also saw this happen, right? This officer who was taking a selfie with one of the very domestic terrorists that was in the building. And so I just feel like, and this isn't to say like, well, not all cops, but just to truly acknowledge that in a profession of nearly 900,000 people, the system is indeed broken, but these many humans are not a monolith. And it is true that both good, needed, honorable service and terrible harms occur in this system every day, right? So like in order to do this work that we need to have done to make this space better, we have to be able to hold space for all of the truths, right? So that's just kind of my take on it. And I felt like what I saw on January 6th just like perfectly captured that, like, yep, both of these things are happening always, every day. So a little bit more about the policing profession. I put this bullet on here because this actually came from this really profound take that I heard from our executive officer. An executive officer is kind of like the third in ranking command at our department. We have the chief, assistant chiefs, and then executive officer. And he gave me permission to kind of quote him on this, but I'll never forget that one day he was saying, gosh, I heard this officer the other day refer to us as law enforcement. He's like, and whenever I hear cops call themselves law enforcement or call our profession law enforcement, he's like, I just kind of shudder, because law enforcement is one thing that we do, right? It's not the only thing that we do. Like in policing and in being a first responder, we do so many things, and enforcing laws is one of them, but it's not all of it. And so he's really trying to like kind of reclaim like the terminology and the titling of what they call themselves. And I just found that really interesting to hear. So I wanted to kind of share that. That's why I tend to say policing instead of law enforcement. I want to just acknowledge, like I've kind of touched on this already, just in what I've observed in this work, which is like all of the things that we place on police as a society when people dial those 3 numbers and they receive a police response, right? So like we've placed the scope of the duties to include like traffic safety, life-saving interventions. So like, and just at our department, that has included an officer seeing someone up on a top of a roof of a really high height, and the officer went up there and had an interaction with them and literally physically pulled them back from jumping, like just in time. And that wasn't in the news, right? Like that didn't get shared. But it's little things like that that really happen all the time that people actually don't hear about. But that's one of the things that they do. They secure scenes, take statements, collect evidence, conduct investigations, respond to calls that range from suspicious activity, trespass, disorderly conduct, robberies, burglaries, vandalism, substance concerns and emergencies, mental health concerns and emergencies, domestic violence, stalking and harassment, neighbor disputes, animal abuse, child abuse, juvenile runaways, missing persons and abductions, trafficking, homicide, suicide, accidental deaths, traffic accidents, fires, vehicle crimes, natural disasters, so much more, right? And it's still just bonkers to me that we expect a single profession to be able to respond to any and all of that. And so I also included on here these links. This Data USA website is really interesting because it breaks down the demographics of a profession. And if you go to these links and you look at the demographics on police, it'll show that it is primarily white, primarily male. And interestingly enough, if you go to social work, it'll show that it's primarily white and primarily female. And so that was just kind of another little glimpse about the policing profession that I wanted to share. But circling back on just like the scope of the many duties that we give police, I wanted to show this animation that I saw this summer that I found really interesting. So when the defund the police slogan came up, I mean, obviously there was a lot of pushback to that. And this is kind of acknowledging like all of the things that society relies on police to respond to, right? But then down here at the bottom, and this person's like, defund the police, how is he supposed to carry all that? And this person's like, he's not. And we're like giving them the keep the peace, but we're like tending to housing over here. We're decriminalizing and regulating certain criminal offenses here. We've got social work right over here that probably needs to be a bigger building, am I right? And we've got mental health services, drug treatment, universal healthcare, education, jobs. Like they shouldn't be holding all of these things. And by defunding or divesting and reallocating into these other systems, we can be lifting that load so that we're not relying on this single profession for so much to respond to in our society. So I think that's really interesting. Okay, a little bit more about like social work opportunities in this field. Obviously, there's what we do, which is victim services, and that exists both on like a local level at like most local municipalities, but also federal. FBI has victim services, and their team responds to a lot of mass shootings and like mass fatality and casualty events. It's sadly a really, really needed service, and they do an amazing job. So that response can look like responding to everyday crimes as well as large events. There's also opportunities in community outreach and in providing first response, and in diverting what would be a police response. And honestly, like that form of diversion, I think is part of dismantling work, which is a word that we hear a lot when we talk about reforms in this space. Critical incident debriefing and supporting the mental health services for police officers and dispatchers. I think this is hugely needed. The people on the front lines of this work, the officers and the dispatchers, they hold a tremendous amount of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. That stuff is real, and it's, you know, I think it affects fitness for duty. And I think that they're not going to be at their best when they're walking around with just debilitating amounts of post-traumatic stress that's not addressed. And so there's a lot of space for reform there. And I think a lot of space for social workers to come in and give them the support that they're needing to make them better. Training these professionals, I think we need to occupy much more space in the training that they receive. We can also be developing programs, evaluating programs. I think every police department needs a community resource liaison who can foster the relationships and partnerships with community agencies, nonprofits, and service providers. There's a job over at APD right now that I've recently just learned about with their sexual assault kit initiative, where they've gotten grants to start processing I imagine folks here are aware of the national backlog in rape kits, but like that's also a job that exists in this space. There are jobs in grant writing. There's also jobs in research, and there are research institutes that their research shapes policy that really inform the profession. And there's just so much more. So that's just kind of a glimpse at like what the many opportunities are to impact positive change in this work. Honestly, I can't say enough about how much I feel that our involvement makes a difference. Just being social workers in this space, when people walk into a police department with a folder of papers that document a stalking concern and being met with someone like us, who can provide them with a trauma-informed, cultural humility-informed support, and kind of a soft place to land in this system. Sometimes even just being a buffer for them. I've had people reach out to me with a concern and I was able to meet their need and they never needed to see or speak to a uniformed officer. They still got what they needed. And they received kind of that buffer from that experience. I have on this next bullet, cards for witnesses to POEDs. So POED stands for Peace Officer Emergency Detention. That only occurs when a person is in immediate risk of harm to themselves or others, right? Usually like active suicidal or homicidal ideations. And we kind of learned through like chatter in the community that there was this misperception, validly so, that when people observed a POED occur, and officers handcuff that individual for safe transport, that person was actually being arrested and taken to jail. And that's not the case. Like, at least the vast majority of the time, when a peace officer emergency detention occurs, that person is taken to the mental health care that they're needing. But they often are handcuffed in order to provide safe transport. And that's like another opportunity that we have, I think, to be having conversations with our officers about improving those types of policies and, you know, building new things so that that handcuffing isn't necessary, right? But regardless, we were hearing community members say, if your friend is suicidal, don't call POED or don't call UTPD because they'll be arrested and they'll go to jail. And we were like, whoa, 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 like we definitely don't want that. And so I helped them develop these two-sided cards that officers now have in their pockets. And if they're conducting a POED and there are any witnesses or people impacted around, maybe that person's roommate or their friend, their professor, they can give them that card because they have to transport pretty quickly and kind of get out of there. They can't necessarily stick around and spend a lot of time explaining everything to them. There's also HIPAA concerns with the person's private healthcare information. But the card just essentially says, witnessing police activity can be distressing. Advocates are available 24 hours a day to lend support. It gives them a number that they can call so they can be connected to one of our advocates. And it also explains that handcuffing is sometimes necessary for safe transport for our caretaking role, and taking someone into custody is not necessarily an arrest, but we may be transporting them to a higher level of care. So that's just one thing that like they weren't thinking about clarifying in the community until a social worker brought it to their attention, and we kind of found a way to you know, like try to improve that that perception in the community. We also do this work by just having really hard but necessary conversations with officers and leadership, helping them to see things the way that the community sees them, and you know, and just come face to face with things that need to be improved. We've talked about the importance of the language that we use and being person-centered and person-first language. We've talked about being trauma-informed and about cultural humility and the reforms that we need. I've been really frank with them about the fact that a 40-hour class to be a mental health officer is great and everything, and it's also a drop in the ocean of what mental health professionals have, and of what we really need out of our professionals who are responding to people in mental health crisis. And that wasn't easy for them to hear, but it was necessary for them to hear, and they've heard it. And, you know, now we're working on like building new things because we've been able to have those conversations. And I'm not sure how far that work would have gotten if we weren't occupying space in order to be able to have them, right? But they're listening and we're doing the work. So this also means we're able to develop new programs. We're able to help reimagine public safety to meet these needs, and that's dismantling work. That's reform. I want to tell y'all a little, I'm not going to read this whole thing to y'all, I promise, but I want to tell y'all a little bit about honestly what I feel is the gold standard for what is possible in completely changing that intercept one of first response in policing. And that's CAHOOTS. CAHOOTS started in Eugene, Oregon just over 30 years ago. It stands for Crisis Assistance, Helping Out on the Streets. And it's like social workers and a medic in a van, and they have been able to partner with Eugene and Springfield police departments in Oregon to now take almost 20% of their call volume, where when those 911 operators receive a call and it meets a certain criteria, then they will send that call over to CAHOOTS, and CAHOOTS will go out without police accompaniment and they will meet the need. And it's usually mental health related or substance related. It may even be medical related. And sometimes making that determination and triaging what's mental health, substance use, or medical, or kind of a combination of all of it, right? Is a really interesting piece that these professionals are best equipped to determine, so that the police can focus on more police applicable things, right? And so I want to just point out here, they don't carry weapons. And last year, out of a total of 24,000 calls, they only needed to call police for backup 250 times. I have screamed that stat to anyone at my department who will listen, because y'all, there's been so much pushback this year from people saying that social workers can't be police or can't be first responders, that we need guns, and that it's so unsafe for us to do that work. We would just get killed left and right. And like the numbers are right there, plain as day. Like, it's perfectly clear that we can, and I think should be doing a lot of that work, actually. And none of them have been seriously injured in all the decades that they've been doing this. So we've got the data to prove that that's simply not the case. But a bit more on CAHOOTS. This is from them. They were also just kind of grappling with, well, how do you partner with police? Because they have to partner with police for the police to send them their calls, right? And people have asked, like, well, how can you support BLM and work with the police? And they said, thoughtfully. We believe Black Lives Matter. We also believe in honesty and transparency. So we want to help the community understand our relationship with the police departments. We've been in Eugene for decades and Springfield for years. Sometimes it is hard, but necessary to hold multiple truths, right? Black Lives Matter, and we contract with our local police departments to provide an alternative to police response. Police officers in the fire departments are our community partners, and in the public safety system, our work is different, but it overlaps. We work together to respond to community needs. And so I just think that's really well said. I think it reflects a lot of what I've already kind of touched on here. And so we kind of just have to hold space for both of those, but there's no way to actually get this work done if we aren't able to come to the table with the police who are already taking these calls and doing this work, in order to make this better for everybody. And honestly, y'all, I could spend the whole hour just on the programs that I've been researching and learning about all year that have been modeled after CAHOOTS. The Denver Star program is one of them, and they launched this summer. And their model is just like CAHOOTS, with a medic and social workers in a van. They have been able to work with Denver Police Department to have certain call criteria dispatched to them so that they're taking it. And then their first 6 months, no one was arrested. And the incidents that led to contact, check this out, were like these call types of trespassing, welfare check, suicidal person, disturbance, intoxication. But what were the actual primary concerns underlying that, right? Mental health, physical health, just unmet basic needs type stuff. So, it's the proven standard. I think it's the way of the future, but it isn't going to happen unless we as social workers just absolutely saturate ourselves into this work and in this system, and are able to work as partners with the police that are already taking these calls, so that they can see what we're capable of and kind of hand some of that stuff off so that we can do this. Again, like, the reforms are happening. A lot has happened this past year. That gives me great hope and promise for the future, including here in Austin. So like this, I saw this headline, y'all may have seen it too, that now when people call 911, they say, do you need police, fire, EMS, or mental health services? So we're finally equipping that like fourth branch of emergency response, and I'm just over the moon about it. So they now have this triaging piece where when a person says they need mental health, they will dispatch that call over to Travis County Integral Care, who, big props to them. They have been doing a lot of that work, somewhat similar to CAHOOTS. They can sometimes go out without police. Sometimes they go as like a co-responder team. And I have the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute logo here because this specific intervention or reform to their 911 call script was influenced by the Meadows Policy Institute. It was research here that informed this policy change. And I also want to just kind of, again, reiterate that research informs policy, policy informs practice, and that's how we make changes happen. And another place that this happens is with the NYU School of Law Policing Project. They say here, we partner with communities and police to promote public safety through transparency, equity, and democratic engagement. They're just kind of acknowledging that like, let me see here. Public safety means ensuring that communities, especially historically marginalized communities, have the resources to address critical social problems, such as access to housing, food security, transportation, healthcare. And it means empowering these communities to participate in shaping what public safety looks like and minimizing, whenever possible, the harms that often accompany policing, such as uses of force and arrests. So they work with communities and with police to think critically about these issues and, you know, kind of build new things. And so, you know, that's just kind of like another piece that I want to leave y'all with, is that the work for social work in this space can look like a lot of different things. But I think it's all needed. My biggest fear this past year has been that, you know, with the huge reckoning that we've had around race and policing, and rightly so, that members of our profession would kind of flee away from opportunities in the policing space, just because it's been in such a state of crisis and it's been such a system of harm. You know, and like often there is a fundamental contradiction for us as social workers and our obligation to protect our clients and their best interests, and our mandates, like as reporters, to sometimes call the police when there are immediate safety concerns. And we as a profession kind of hold this conflict sometimes in being uncertain whether our BIPOC or LGBTQ plus clients will be made safe or possibly made unsafe by receiving a police response. But I think that really the only alternative here, or the only option we have here, is to, instead of running away from having anything to do with police, is to actually kind of infiltrate and just, you know, swarm upon this profession to saturate ourselves in it and improve it in as many ways as we possibly can. I think that's really just the only way forward and the best way forward. So that's my take. I will share on the UTPD side, just this year, they launched a specialized unit in the police department for response to mental health calls and like welfare concerns. So they call it UCIT. It's the University Crisis Intervention Team. So they have specially trained officers who use an unmarked vehicle and dressed down uniforms like jeans and a polo. And those officers try to, and this is their language that the PD used, they said, we'll attempt to decrease the criminalization of mental health by providing alternatives to jail, such as resources and out and inpatient referrals. Y'all, they're listening, okay? Like, that's good stuff to hear. And I will let you know that you may not have heard or seen a whole lot from UTPD recently, and that can leave community members feeling like nothing is being done at all. But just know that there is a lot that's happening. I've been involved in a lot of meetings and conversations this year with a lot of multidisciplinary partners, and we are absolutely in the works on some really big things that I would love to be able to share with y'all about, but unfortunately I just cannot quite yet because we're still waiting on that official announcement to come out. That can just be one of the hard things about working in this system, is that sometimes, as much as you want to share about something that you're working on, you just have to wait until you're given the green light on it. But please be listening, because there will be more to come soon on some really exciting reforms and changes that are being built in that space here on campus even. So I want to just kind of conclude by acknowledging that this work is hard. If you are a social worker in a police department who hasn't lost a lot of sleep this past year, then I would be worried that you're not paying attention. This work is needed. I hope that that's been clear through everything I've shared today. And I want to just quote Fatima Mann and take a moment to like center and uplift BIPOC voices. Fatima is the founder and director of the Community Advocacy and Healing Project. And she has said, serving communities in need isn't a superpower, but our responsibility as humans to be humane to others that need us. And she has said, this is love work. This is putting our love for our community into tangible action. So that's really the conclusion of my talk. And I'm happy to answer any questions about all the stuff I just said.
Right. Marica, that was incredible. We have another few minutes. It was a great talk. I enjoyed it very much. We have another few minutes before the end to allow that sort of question and answer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to end the recording so that anyone who may have been nervous to unmute or put on video, if they're recording on, will be able to do so. So